Hi, friends, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm going to share with you a strategy on how to manage your fears and feel more safe with yourself. This is something that I wished I had learned years ago when I was going through some real difficult times growing up, having been born with a bilateral cleft lip and palate. So be sure to watch to the end because I'll share this 5-step strategy and how it can really help. Before we get going, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so that we can stay connected and for you to be notified when there are new videos to watch. When I was a freshman in college, I developed what I thought was chronic fatigue syndrome. From the required classwork, navigating walking around a campus that was significantly larger than my high school campus, and working part-time, I was tired all the time. Everything was just so big. The classes, the campus, and just the sheer number of people that I was around every day. It got to the point that I became so tired that I would take to sleeping in my car instead of going to class. And during this time, I was desperate to put a label on what it was I was experiencing, and I landed on chronic fatigue. It made sense to me because I was tired all the time. But a quick note here, this was not a diagnosis I got from a doctor. This was a self-diagnosis. Thinking about everything I just said, you may know what I'm about to say next, but it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't experiencing chronic fatigue syndrome. I was, in fact, severely depressed. I found the classwork difficult and unsure of how to approach my professors to ask for help. Everyone else around me just seemed to know what to do. They seemed to know how to do the work. And I felt like I was just some small-town kid that shouldn't even be there. Just for some context, I graduated from a high school that had a total of 500 kids. And my very first biology class that I took my freshman year in college had 500 kids in it. To say I was overwhelmed is an understatement. Put on top of all of that, what I've now come to realize was probably the real cause was my extreme discomfort and fear of going from my small high school where everybody knew each other to a place where I knew no one. I say that this is probably the driving force behind my depression because this was the first time since middle school that I had to meet a large group of new people. Growing up as I did in a small town, but looking the way that I did, had its positive and negative aspects. On the negative side, I never saw anybody else that looked like me. But on the positive side, my small town lended itself to a certain layer of protection because the newness of my facial difference eventually wore off with my fellow students. Fast forward to my first day on my college campus, and I was thrust right back into that fierce state of hypervigilance that I faced when I was first starting school back in my small town and receiving the longer looks, the stares, the whispers behind my back. And although I didn't know it at the time, I was in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze, or fight, flight, sleep in my case. Looking back on that time, I see a frightened young woman not knowing what to do with herself, and my heart breaks a little because I wish I could go back and tell her to just put that fear down. I wish I could tell her to stop, take a deep breath, and really look at those around her, because if she could, she would see that those other people were not staring or whispering or even being unkind to her, and in all practicality, they probably weren't even paying that much attention to her at all. She was projecting her expectation of that behavior onto others because she didn't want to be blindsided when the hurt come. But the hurt from others didn't come. The hurt came from within her. And all she ended up doing was working herself into a depression and a state of extreme exhaustion from the constant hypervigilance she thought she needed in order to keep herself safe. The efforts we make to keep ourselves safe can sometimes do more harm than good, especially when the problem or fear we are experiencing is of the possibility of something happening. Our minds are powerful, and if we let our minds run away with our fears, it can become overwhelming and paralyzing, so much so that we end up sleeping in our cars instead of going to biology class. So how can we help keep ourselves in check when it comes to understanding if the size of our fear is legitimate or not? From my experience during that time, so much of my fear was unfounded. The size of the fear in my mind was overinflated. And so, for starters, one step that would have helped me was to write down my fears, to get them down on paper and see them on the page. From there, I could have determined if that fear was legitimate or only one that I was creating in my mind as a potential and not an actual circumstance. From there, I could have determined just how large my fear was. Was I overinflating the size of the issue? Next, I would have been able to think about the likelihood of whether this fear or problem would come to pass. As I mentioned earlier, looking back, I know that the other people around me were probably not paying much attention to me at all, or at least not in the way that I was projecting they were. From that point, I could have thought about how bad it really would have been if they were looking at me in a mocking or judgmental way. You can think of this as like a sliding scale of intensity. Sure, being looked at in a judgmental way wouldn't have felt good in the moment, but it would have only lasted a moment. So on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being minimal effect to 10 being the most intense, awful feeling, what would my feelings have been? Realistically, back then, it probably would have been a 4 or a 5, but it wouldn't have lasted forever. And finally, I would have had the knowing that came from withstanding the momentary discomfort of a lingering look or judgmental stare, and I would have felt more safe and secure with myself that I weathered the situation and had a worthwhile strategy to deal with my fears. So, let's review those steps. Step 1, write down your fear. Step 2, determine the legitimacy and the size of your fear. Step 3, determine the likelihood of that fear actually occurring. Step 4, think about how you would feel if that fear actually happened. And this is where you'll use that sliding scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being minimal effect to 10 being the most intense. And step 5, realize that even if your fear does come to pass, you have gained the knowledge that you can withstand and recover from it, and now have a framework to use in the future when new fears start to overwhelm you. I'd love to hear from you and what strategies you use to manage your fears, so leave me a note down in the comments. I've also put a link down in the description to the resource that I use for the framework I shared with you today, just in case you want to learn more. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.